ces organisations de la société civile pour préparer l'avenir. Quelles sont les leçons que nous avons et les enseignements que nous avons tirés de la crise et quelles sont les priorités pour le monde de demain et comment peut-on faire de ce monde un endroit meilleur? Ce sont là les 3 questions que nous nous sommes posées et voici les réponses.
Hello, everyone. I want to give special thanks to President Macron for bringing us all together and to all of you for participating. As you know, the pandemic is a challenge like no other. It's been devastating for public health and the global economy, and in both cases it has fallen hardest on the most vulnerable. Tackling this crisis requires strong collaboration among public and private sector leaders, philanthropists, and civil society. At Bloomberg Philanthropies, we stepped up to do our part, including teaming up with President von der Leyen to bring tests, treatments, and vaccines to people in vulnerable communities. We're all in this together, and the Paris Peace Forum is an important effort to help build partnerships and work towards a better, healthier future.
This COVID crisis is a reminder that injustice kills. Locking people up in overcrowded prisons, exposing essential workers to harm, bargaining away the rights of refugees, these aren't actions that are just wrong, they are lethal. So lethal that they fuel health crises that threaten the entire planet.
The lesson we draw from the crisis is that no challenge can be faced alone. We are not saved until everyone is saved, and we must work together.
More than ever, I think this is a year that calls on the world to put digital technology and data to work. We need to use data and technology to protect public health, to address the urgent needs created by COVID-19, not just to serve the public health authorities of the world, but to pursue the quest and ultimately the distribution of a vaccine and better treatments.
The lesson we draw from the COVID crisis is the need for enhanced cooperation and concerted actions to address global challenges, pandemic, climate change, and enduring inequalities.
Multilateralism and cooperation are more than ever the keys to success. Through dialogue, we must come closer together and harmonize the health measures taken by the different countries.
A lesson we draw from the COVID crisis is how vital, reliable and transparent information is to save lives and bring people together, and how much digital tools can do to facilitate broad inclusion. We must make the most of this to build and sustain peace.
Our priority for the post-COVID world is to support and accelerate a green and digital transition.
To build back a better, stronger and more equal world for our future generations.
To build on our people's talent, to find creative and new ways to work together, and to combine the best of the old with the best of the new.
First, as always, to help our clients to be present and useful. Second one, to transform our model, to be both human and digital. And the third one is to fight climate change. I am convinced that banks can play a very huge role for that.
We need not only to rebuild our economies, but to reimagine a brighter future, a future that creates through technology better access for every community.
Our priority for the post-COVID world is to reconcile immediate action against the pandemic with the imperative need to build pathways to sustainability. The Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals are our roadmap.
Our solution to make the world a better place is to put the SDGs back on track. We will strengthen multilateralism and build international partnerships to do this with young people in the driving seat.
Our solution to make the world a better place is to be an incubator for green and digital finance and a knowledge bank for ideas.
If every company seeking to invest in their communities through corporate citizenship activities first asks, is any other company or organization already working on this issue? And if yes, can I partner with them to scale the impact? Then we will achieve more, faster, B4IG, collaborating across business, government, and society to ensure inclusive growth.
As a member of society, to continue to put D&I at the heart of our strategy, as the crisis has highlighted the critical importance of being inclusive in the face of adversity.
We also need to put technology to work to protect the world's democracies, with a commitment to more modern global norms that will ensure that the world respects the principles, the fundamental human rights that are at the core of every democracy, every democratic society.
And our solution to make the world a better place is to help amplify voices for peace through new and traditional channels, helping women and men, young and old, to build inclusive, lasting peace.
Our priority now is to reject the return to the normal. Normal failed. Normal gave us inadequate health systems, weakening multilateralism, tolerance for racism in all its forms in all of our institutions, and neglect of our relationship to this planet. Let's work right now, starting today, to create societies that are fairer, more inclusive, and more equitable. For too long, the most powerful have shaped policies towards their own narrow benefit. It's time for democratic systems that aren't co-opted by those in power, but rather hold those in power to account. Systems that aren't captured by corrupt interests, but that truly serve the public. This is the urgent, energizing, and unifying enterprise of this hour.
Welcome to the official ceremony of the Paris Peace Forum. I'm Melissa Bell, Paris correspondent for CNN. We are partners of the Peace Forum and really delighted to be here today with Justin Weiss. Hello, you are of course the Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, the man behind the idea, and we're going to hear from you in a moment about exactly what we can expect today and what the idea was. To begin with, we're also of course going to be hearing from some of the more than 50 heads of states and international organizations who've taken part in today's forum to try to get an idea of how they feel that a post-COVID-19 world should look. A reminder, of course, that such a global crisis really requires at least a global conversation. Justin Weiss, tell us first of all about the spirit of the Paris Peace Forum, why you began it.
So in 2018, when we started the Paris Peace Forum, the idea was really that we needed to fight back against the deterioration of multilateralism and international cooperation. We needed to get states back at the table, but not just states, also other actors that we need to fight global problems like this pandemic, like climate change, like biodiversity. And we decided to do this event on the international agenda once a year with foundations, the private sector, NGOs, citizens and others, so as to bring concrete solutions to these problems.
And of course you couldn't have foreseen that the third edition of this summit, this forum, would be held in these circumstances, virtually, and with the world facing arguably the biggest global crisis ever.
Absolutely. The paradox is that the COVID-19 crisis sort of made our lives more difficult because we had to move entirely online here for this edition. At the same time, it sort of showed the importance of cooperation. We've seen a sort of almost a breakdown of international cooperation since the pandemic began, with very few meetings of the G7 or G20. Even at the UN, there were few meetings on that. And so we need to reconstruct that discussion and have leaders work together.
Of course, the very fabric of what might allow global conversations sort of disappeared exactly when we needed it most. Give us an idea of what we can expect then in the next hour and 45 minutes.
So what we did at the Paris Peace Forum is we tried to ask all the world leaders that thought they could come here in presence to instead send us a message on what they want for the world of tomorrow when we get out of the crisis first, that's the first mission we have, and then we construct the world of tomorrow. And that's what we'll be hearing in the first hour of this official ceremony.
And we will, just after that, in about an hour's time, then be taking you live to the Elysee, where Emmanuel Macron and those leaders he has gathered around him physically, some he's been speaking with remotely. We'll be hearing much more about the fruits of the negotiations and the talks that have gone on there. First, though, here's a look at what some of those global leaders had to say about how they see a post-COVID-19 world.
In 2020, we discovered how much we depend on one another. The pandemic has reminded us that we cannot take our way of life for granted, nor our values and principles or the respect for human rights and democracy. Challenges that existed before the pandemic must still be overcome. Social inequalities, migration feeding into uncontrolled flows, multilateralism is being challenged, global warming has escalated, and biodiversity is being destroyed. We cannot control when a crisis hits us, but we can control how we choose to react to this crisis. We need a global and regional consensus that prioritize equitable distribution and genuine wealth creation.
Of utmost concern. On this, we're encouraged by the efforts of the World Health Organization and other international agencies working to ensure that vaccine delivery will be equitable across all countries.
Requires effective and comprehensive strategy and a collective effort at global level.
We are living in one of the most challenging times in human history. The only way for us to survive and thrive is to work together.
Let us use the SDGs as a foundation for new common principles for a fairer, more inclusive, and more sustainable future for all.
Only a timely, coordinated, and efficient response at local and international level can limit the shock waves to our healthcare, economies, societies, including politics.
The devastation to biodiversity caused by deforestation is harming our planet, and therefore the future of generations to come.
Areas where the current pandemic has taught us most. It was an eye-opener. We realized the scale of efforts required to restore our biodiversity, to reach our climate ambitions, and to give future generations a chance.
COVID-19 has unveiled a new reality in the world order, has made clear that only through multilateral cooperation can we effectively deal and overcome this pandemic.
Bien que la tentation du repli.
While the temptation to fall back on national identity, there is an agreement to recognize that cooperation and international solidarity are essential to effectively fight against this pandemic.
Be confined to borders, and they cannot be resolved without collective action.
Axé sur l'amélioration des conditions.
Focusing on improving living conditions for the most vulnerable and ensuring fair access to basic needs. In other words, clean water, healthcare, nutrition, education, and safety. This crisis becomes an opportunity. It is our chance to make our world fairer and more equitable. The availability of vaccines must not be a purely commercial issue. Scientific cooperation is now more than ever necessary because disasters do not respect political difference or geographical borders between countries. We need to put the interests of people at the core of our policies and actions Our foremost priority is to protect human health and lives and ensure affordable access to COVID-19 vaccines and medicines for the peoples of all countries and territories.
Be able to overcome the corona crisis, and together we will come back stronger.
A selection there of just some of those voices participating in today's forum, and a reminder, of course, of the fact that even as we're separated on this issue, it affects everyone in such an extraordinary way. We're going to hear now from the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping.
Your Excellency, President Emmanuel Macron, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It gives me great pleasure to attend this third edition of the Paris Peace Forum. Since its inception, the forum has enabled parties to deepen mutual understanding on improving global governance, promoting multilateralism, and safeguarding world peace. The role this important platform has played is positive and significant, and I want to commend President Macron and France for all their worthy efforts. Right now, the global landscape is fast evolving. Traditional and non-traditional security threats keep emerging. Instability and uncertainties are growing in the international situation. Global threats and challenges require global responses. With that in mind, I wish to share with you the following three proposals. First of all, let us show solidarity and help each other to jointly fight COVID-19. The coronavirus is still wreaking havoc around the world. We need to put people and life first, place people's well-being front and center, respect science, and make more targeted and concerted response. We need to give full play to the crucial leadership role of the World Health Organization in facilitating the joint global response against COVID-19. China will continue to share with others experience in containing the virus and expertise in diagnostics and therapeutics, and provide assistance in essential medical supplies. China will honor its commitment to make Chinese vaccines a global public good. China will help the global community, developing countries in particular, enhance preparedness for public health emergencies. Together, we could build a better global community of health for all. Second, let us embrace openness and cooperation to jointly promote recovery. 2 weeks ago, the fifth plenum of the 19th Chinese Communist Party Central Committee deliberated on and adopted the recommendations on formulating China's 14th five-year plan for economic and social development and the long-range goals for 2035. The course is being charted for China's development in the years ahead. China will continue to follow the new development philosophy, foster a new development paradigm, and pursue high-quality development. To this end, China will stay committed to deepening reform and opening wider to the world. China will work with the rest of the international community to keep the global industrial and supply chains stable and foster an open world.
绿色经济是人类发展的潮流，也是促进复苏的关键。中欧都坚持绿色发展理念，致力落实应对气候变化巴黎协定。不久前，我提出中国将提高国家自主贡献力度，力争2030年前二氧化碳排放达到峰值，2060年前实现碳中和。 中方将为此制定实施规划。我们愿同欧方、法方，以明年分别举行生物多样性、气候变化、自然保护国际会议为契机，深化相关合作。第三，秉持正义，维护和平。我们应该坚持和平共处，尊重各国发展权利。 尊重各国自主选择的发展道路和模式，坚持多边主义，反对单边主义、霸权主义、强权政治， 反对各种形式的恐怖主义和极端暴力行径，维护世界公平正义和和平安全。中国和法国同为联合国安理会常任理事国，在维护世界和平方面负有特殊重要的责任。中国奉行独立自主的和平外交政策，始终不渝走和平发展道路。我们呼吁各国维护国际法和国际关系基本准则，根据事情的是非曲直决定自己的立场，摒弃意识形态偏见和对立。中国愿同法国在内的各国加强沟通和协调，为推动政治解决国际和地区问题，维护世界和平稳定做出积极贡献。女士们、先生们、朋友们，大道之行，天下为公。和平与发展是时代主题，也是不可抗拒的历史潮流。面对人类面临的挑战，世界各国应该加强团结，而不是制造隔阂；推进合作，而不是挑起冲突；携手共建人类命运共同体，造福世界各国人民。预祝本届论坛取得圆满成功，谢谢大家。
We just heard Xi Jinping, President of the People's Republic of China. So he emphasized fighting COVID-19, promoting a green recovery and safeguarding peace. I now suggest we turn to the country which will be in charge of the next G20 and hear from Giuseppe Conte, the Prime Minister of Italy.
The 2020 edition of the Paris Peace Forum takes place in hard times. The pandemic still rages through our daily lives, hitting our societies and economies. Terrorism is threatening again Europe, and the climate emergency calls for an urgent collective effort to safeguard the future of our planet. If there is a lesson to learn from this unprecedented situation, this is the value of an effective international cooperation. Shared problems, threatening peace and stability, need shared and urgent responses. But urgent action does not mean short-term vision. We need to look beyond the emergency and focus our global action on fostering an inclusive, sustainable and resilient recovery. Italy, as the next G20 presidency, host of the Global Health Summit in 2021, in cooperation with the European Commission and partner of the United Kingdom for COP26, is fully committed to build, facilitate and promote multilateral efforts towards a greener, more equitable and healthier world. Italy is determined to pursue these objectives as a nation, but also as a member of the European Union. And we are proud that its plan for the post-pandemic recovery is devoted to the next generation. The present is crucial to set the future. Let us show that we can now stand united to pursue our common goal to transform our individual destinies into a collective better one. Let's shape together a more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive society. Thank you.
Giuseppe Conte there, who has of course long called for much more cooperation, although you'll remember when Italy was first hit as hard as it was as the pandemic came to Europe, he's long called for greater coordination between even European countries on this. Interesting to hear from two leaders of such important countries in terms of how hard they were hit. We're going to have a listen now to Justin Trudeau, of course, the Prime Minister of Canada, to say what he has to say on this.
Bonjour à tous. Hello everyone. Cette année, le Forum de Paris sur la paix sera une excellente occasion de mettre en commun des idées et des solutions concrètes pour contribuer à notre réponse collective contre la pandémie et pour rebondir dans un monde post-COVID. À l'heure actuelle, chaque pays travaille fort pour protéger ses citoyens des impacts de cette crise sanitaire et relancer son économie. Mais on doit absolument continuer notre travail en tant que communauté internationale. Et un des éléments les plus importants sera d'assurer un accès juste et équitable à un éventuel vaccin. C'est pour cette raison que le Canada fait partie de l'initiative mondiale COVAX. One of the central lessons of the pandemic is that governments and the international community can mobilize when the stakes are high. And we must ask ourselves now how we can use the same motivation and the same energy that we demonstrated in recent months to address other global challenges. From fighting climate change to building economies that work for everyone to advancing gender equality, we have a lot to do. And Canada is taking a leadership role in finding innovative solutions to make sure that developing countries have the necessary resources not only to recover from this pandemic, but to fight the most pressing issues of our time, too. That's why we're co-leading the global initiative on financing for development in the era of COVID-19 and beyond, with Jamaica and the UN Secretary General. Notre pays est également plus déterminé que jamais à réaliser le programme 2030 afin de promouvoir la prospérité tout en protégeant notre planète. En septembre, le Canada a notamment annoncé une contribution supplémentaire de 400 millions de dollars au développement international cette année. L'objectif ultime est de préserver les gains de la dernière décennie en matière de développement et d'assurer la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable. Mais pour bâtir le monde meilleur et en paix dont on rêve tous, on doit être créatif. C'est le message que je lance à tous ceux qui participent à ce forum cette année. Repensez la façon de faire les choses et ayez une vision à long terme. Despite the challenges before us, I know we can bounce back together and build a better planet that is healthier and safer, cleaner and more competitive, and fairer and more inclusive for everyone. Thank you.
Justin Trudeau there in absolute perfect French and English. I'd like to ask you, Justin, what you made of what we just listened to, that sample of voices, global leaders, of course, really invested in this question, and what you made of what you heard.
You know, what's interesting is that the effect of the crisis was to have countries sort of seal themselves off from the world and turn to introversion, I would say, as they were protecting their citizens, as Justin Trudeau lastly said. And what I take comfort in seeing these series of interventions is how much they stress togetherness, that is to say, how much they stress the importance of working together on that. And so the question then is, will acts follow words, right?
And that's what we're looking to hear today, what precise and I suppose concrete measures we can imagine that would allow this conversation to continue.
You know, several of them, as I was listening, talked about vaccines, and as you know, a bit later this afternoon, we'll have another session of the Paris Peace Forum devoted to that. Prime Minister Trudeau alluded to COVAX, which is the vaccine facility of this initiative called Act A, which has been the effort of the international community to precisely fight what has been called vaccine nationalism. That is to say, everyone taking care only of its own population, which in the end is self-defeating, because we know we need to distribute vaccines around the world. And so during that session at 5:30 later today, we'll see if these leaders can really deliver, and I think we'll have a couple of announcements to make.
Because of course you referred to that initial reaction, which was of course to retreat behind borders and to search for vaccines nationally. I wonder what you made more broadly of what the Chinese president had to say about the shift to multilateralism more broadly. That for a while it had looked as though a unilateral approach to foreign affairs and international relations was winning the day in a number of countries. Do you really think that at this stage we can look ahead to a more multilateral approach becoming the norm once again?
I hope we can. I would not venture saying that it will happen, but certainly, of course, the words of the Chinese president are encouraging about, in particular, safeguarding peace and justice. You know, obviously, we'll have to see how far that can go. And of course, behind this is the big question of what will happen with the United States, where we just had an election a week ago with change coming. And of course, the extent and limits of that change will have to be assessed. But you know, we know that we will have an administration that sees international affairs through the prism of cooperation, multilateralism, rather than unilateralism. And so, you know, let's hope that these speeches that we're listening will sort of come and get to be realized in the concrete world.
Well, we'll come back to that, I'm sure, the difference that the presence of the United States will or will not make at the table, and the absence of it, what that has meant on so many of these issues. Let's have another listen now. Let's have a listen now to some of the other important voices that are taking part in today's conversation, the beginning of the conversation, about what a post-COVID-19 world should look like.
Whatever shape the post-COVID world takes, together is the only sustainable way forward for the entire global community.
Nous pouvons trouver des solutions aux problèmes les plus pressants et complexes du monde, mais seulement à la condition d'y travailler ensemble, en atteignant un nouveau consensus international basé sur la solidarité, la coopération et un respect mutuel de l'état de droit.
Seules des organisations internationales fortes et bénéficiant pleinement de notre confiance pourront permettre des avancées franches et justes pour tous.
I see the post-COVID world as the world of closer cooperation, more solidarity, stronger compassion in our families, neighborhoods, working place, on the state level, internationally.
Nous devons regarder au-delà de nous-mêmes et travailler en unisson afin de pouvoir répondre aux problèmes qui, de plus en plus, transcendent nos frontières nationales.
L'actuelle pandémie est à l'origine de profondes difficultés au sein de l'humanité. Elle a mis sur lumière la dette de la globalisation en vue d'assurer le bien-être commun.
การยึดประชาชนเป็นศูนย์กลางก็เป็นเสาหลักสำคัญในการรับมือกับความท้าทายนี้ตลอดจนการสร้างฐานชีวิตวิถีใหม่ที่สอดคล้องกับเป้าหมายการพัฒนาที่ยั่งยืนภายในปีคริสตศักราช 2030 โดยไม่ทิ้งใครไว้ข้างหลัง
Naučili smo da nam je neophodna snažna globalna saradnja, a ne globalno nadmetanje.
Длабоко сум уверен дека единството и солидарноста ни се потребни повеќе од кога било. А ние лидерите треба во практика да ги покажеме овие вредности кои ќе бидат на висина на предизвикот, да не познаваат граници и да бидат глобални.
Effective way to pool concrete resources and actions guided by existing global mechanisms.
In producing such vaccines, multinationals and governments must ensure that there is a fair distribution at a price that is affordable to all.
How to protect our economies, or whether it's a good solution to just pour money into our economic systems, creating skyrocketing public debts to GDP ratio all over the world, or we should act differently.
L'accélération de la pandémie de COVID-19 a prouvé à quel point nos pays étaient interdépendants.
Iako je pandemija zasenila sva druga velika pitanja, ne zaboravimo da ona nisu nestala. Sav ovaj zastrašujući scenarij pandemije može izgledati samo kao minoran izazov u poređenju sa krizom koja prijeti čovječanstvu ukoliko ne budemo odlučnije djelovali u borbi protiv klimatskich promjena.
W wizji tej nie może zabraknąć silnych podmiotów państwowych, rządów, które odważnie kształtują relacje pomiędzy instytucjami, korporacjami i obywatelami.
Es preciso que en cada país aceleremos la acción en todos los niveles,
por todos los actores. Y tenemos en la Agenda 2030 y sus 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible una hoja de ruta colectiva para avanzar.
We need to think about sustainable and more equitable solutions. We need to think green and in a digital context.
We wish to renew with strength and determination our convinced appeal for a collective commitment to multilateralism. This essential concept must underlie our common action.
Hoy tenemos la oportunidad y la responsabilidad de avanzar hacia un consenso internacional acerca de las prioridades en el mundo post-COVID.
Международните организации, ООН, Световната здравна организация, знаят как. Но ние трябва да ги подкрепим, ние трябва да направим всичко, да работят максимално ефективно. И всеки да даде своя принос.
C'est ainsi qu'elles gagneront une nouvelle valeur ajoutée et une légitimité qui nous aidera à maintenir la paix et la prospérité à long terme.
The time is therefore now that we come together as multilateral partners to contain COVID-19.
Those other voices, global leaders involved in the conversation that's happening here today. I think one of the things that's striking, Justin, is when you listen to them, how many of them are talking not just about the immediate concern of finding a vaccine, finding a solution to this crisis as quickly as possible, but also that this is an opportunity for something much broader than that in terms of what is rebuilt on the other side.
It's true, it's striking that many of them are actually alluding to climate very, very precisely. That is to say, let's not waste this crisis and let's take the opportunity to build a different world, and so calling on that. I also noticed that many of them are referring to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has set in 2015 for 2030. It's also called the Agenda 2030. You know, these 17 goalposts that should be reached by 2030, and for which the fear is great that the COVID pandemic will sort of push us back and will sort of prevent us from reaching these goals.
I wonder whether then, despite the sort of the headlines and the rather dramatic withdrawal of the United States, for instance, from the Paris Accord, in fact, one of the messages today is that quietly, without the cameras of the world perhaps paying that much attention, multilateralism has been continuing the important work of these conversations. And in fact, there seems to be a pretty broad consensus on that need to work together and on the idea that the structures that we have now are just not enough.
Yes. You know, there's no doubt that multilateralism had been deteriorating and has had on top of that, of the past few years, has had on top of that with the crisis a sort of new breakdown. This said, we have seen either through video conference or through a series of small meetings, leaders trying to reconnect and trying to do things. It has been too little too late. But with today's Paris Peace Forum, we are hoping to sort of re-energize that cooperation, simply because there's no other way.
Of course, throughout that time, a single-minded champion of multilateralism has been the French president. Often a voice lone in the wilderness, one felt, when you looked around at the leaders around him. It was, of course, shortly after he came to the presidency in France that the idea of the Paris Peace Forum came about, a determined attempt to keep the idea alive?
That's correct. What happened was when President Macron assumed office, he was struck by the fact that the international system was not delivering, and that it was necessary. You know, one of the ideas was that we have one moment every year for economic issues, and that's Davos in January. We have several conferences, especially in February, with the Munich Security Conference on political military issues, on security issues, if you'd like. There's also the Shangri-La Dialogue, the Manama Dialogue, and many others. But there was no time on the international agenda that was devoted specifically to international cooperation, and not only to buttressing multilateralism, but also to expanding multilateralism to other actors, which we know is a necessity. And so that was the original vision that President Macron lent its support to as early as 2018. Remember, it was a century, exactly a century after the armistice of World War I, November 11, 2018. And the idea was that we should not let the world go the way that the world went in the 1920s and 1930s, that is to say, a breakdown of global governance leading to war.
Well, of course, it was a moment when Donald Trump was also visiting Paris at the time. He was invited, but chose not to take part at the time. What did the absence of the United States at these sorts of tables in this conversation behind the idea of multilateralism mean? I mean, has it been as damaging as one might have expected?
To a certain extent, yes. But let me tell you the story. On November 11, 2018, Donald Trump was actually in Paris since he had been present for the ceremonies commemorating the 100th anniversary of World War I, of the armistice. But he chose not to come because we know he is not a great friend of multilateralism or international institutions. Indeed, he withdrew from many of the institutions that we'll hear the leaders of talk this afternoon, like the WHO, for example, and of course the Paris Agreement, etc. So he didn't come, whereas we had 75 leaders coming. Then in 2019, we didn't have any representative from the administration. However, what should be said is that if this was lacking, the United States was actually very present throughout the history of the Paris Peace Forum, simply because what made up for the absence of the administration was a flurry of NGOs, of philanthropic foundations, of local governments and mayors in particular. And I must say that this has been in 2018, 2019, and again this year, in spite of the digital edition, the second most populous, I would say, population that has come to the forum, that attends the forum, and we've been quite energized by the presence of Americans, except for the administration.
And so even as they've withdrawn and as we imagine their return to sort of multilateral forums and a multilateral approach, I wonder whether the world has changed, or to what extent, in becoming more multipolar perhaps than it was even before. I mean, it returns to a conversation that is different than when it left it.
I think you're totally right. There has been a change. There has been a change, and I don't want to get too theoretical here, but there has been a change in the repartition of power on the international system. And certainly the question is one that you almost asked, which is, can we have multilateralism, that is the cooperation of countries in institutions, when we have multipolarity, that is to say, when we have equal powers rather than one dominant power, which was more or less the case in the 1990s, for example? Can we still have that system of multilateralism, which we think is optimal for the interests of all, when we have great power competition and when powers are more equal amongst themselves?
And that is what we will discover, no doubt, over the coming months and years. Perhaps we could have a listen to one of those important voices in that conversation. The Prime Minister of India also adding his voice to the conversation today.
President Macron, distinguished participants, Namaste, bonjour. The Paris Peace Forum is a landmark event of our times. In the middle of such a crisis, the very idea of such a forum is a great sign. I commend President Macron for his efforts to bring us together. It shows a global commitment to peace, harmony, and compassion. I convey India's solidarity with France and other countries in the fight against terrorism. Excellencies, we demonstrate both in thought and action that we are looking towards a future of peace and harmony. After all, a peaceful planet ensures universal prosperity. Guided by a human-centric approach, India looks forward to making an effective contribution for global good. Today, in the Paris Peace Forum, I would like to recite a Shanti Mantra, a prayer of peace from ancient Indian scriptures written thousands of years ago. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya, Tamso Ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrutyun Ma Amrutam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti, which means let us go from illusion towards reality. Let us go from darkness towards light. Let us go from death towards life. And let there be peace, peace, peace. I thank you all.
So we just heard from Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. We'll now get back to Europe and listen to Pedro Sánchez, the Prime Minister of Spain.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, COVID-19 has accelerated some of the pre-existing transformations the world has been going through for the last few years. It has pushed our societies to understand in a very dramatic way how interdependent we are from one another, how important it is that we take care of each other, how fundamental it is that we cooperate in an efficient manner to overcome the overlapping crisis of our time. The structures we gave ourselves many decades ago need to be reinforced and strengthened, not only to put an end to the pandemic as soon as possible, of course to speed up economic and social recovery, but also to tackle the immense challenges posed by climate change, the digital transformation, or the rise of inequalities, just to name a few. We cannot choose the time we live in, but we definitely must choose how we want to live it. This is our main responsibility as leaders at this crucial point in history. I firmly believe that we need to enhance international and multilateral cooperation so as to make the 2030 agenda achievable. We need strong multilateral institutions to succeed. We must be able to build back better and greener. We must recover in a fair, inclusive, and sustainable manner, leaving no one behind. At this historical crossroad, we must raise the bar of ambition. Only by doing so, we will gain the future for generations to come. Thank you.
The President of Spain there, Pedro Sánchez. We're going to hear now from one of those leaders really widely praised for her handling of the epidemic in her country, the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
Ina mana ina reo tēnā koutou katoa. President Macron, thank you for convening this important event at this challenging time. COVID-19 makes it difficult for us to come together to solve the global challenges we face, but it also serves to highlight our absolute interdependence. No one is safe until we are all safe. We are a team of 7.8 billion. We must step up with political will and find global solutions to the urgent challenges of our era. We must tackle the COVID-19 pandemic together with determination, good science and policy. Develop and distribute a vaccine on an equitable basis. We must commit to a sustainable economic recovery that protects the most vulnerable, creates decent jobs, rejects trade protectionism, and maintains well-functioning supply chains and open markets. We must help small island developing states, such as in the Pacific, begin to recover by ensuring continued support from the international community, including international financial institutions. are available to manage the acute fiscal challenges that lie ahead. We must fulfill the commitments of the Paris Agreement. We must urgently agree new global goals to halt the decline of biodiversity globally and progress a new oceans treaty focused on conservation and the sustainable use of high seas marine biodiversity. We must reform environmentally harmful subsidies and redirect these billions of dollars of public funds into transitioning to a low emissions, sustainable future. As partners with shared values, we must ensure the recovery respects and promotes the human rights of all. This includes accelerating action to achieve gender equality and ensure the empowerment of all women and girls. We must protect and respect the role of our international dispute settlement bodies and accountability mechanisms, including the International Court of Justice, International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Criminal Court and the WTO appellate body. And we must cooperate internationally to resolve existing conflicts and increase investment in peace building and disarmament to prevent future ones. Effective international cooperation matters more than ever. So let's keep working together. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
So, Melissa, it's really interesting because Prime Minister Ardern from New Zealand hit on at least 3 issues that we are tackling here at the forum. She spoke about the High Seas Treaty, that is to say, how do we protect and preserve biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And that we had a really important panel this morning with Richard Branson, Commissioner Sinkevicius from the EU and others on how to push that treaty beyond the finish line. She also talked about climate, and just an hour from now we'll have another important panel with Alok Sharma, who will be presiding over COP26 next year, and also John Kerry from the US representing that climate ambition. One last thing she didn't allude to, but she will be part of, will be tomorrow morning at the Paris Peace Forum. We'll have a session on the Christchurch call. You may remember the horrific attack, the horrific terrorist attack in March 2019, which resulted in dozens slaughtered in Christchurch, New Zealand. Well, 2 months afterwards, along with President Macron, Prime Minister Ardern, along with social the big platforms and tech companies, launched the Christchurch call to pull out of the networks the images of terrorism and fight against radicalization on the internet. So I found her intervention particularly interesting and of course a good echo to what we are doing here at the Paris Peace Forum. But I suggest we now turn to the President of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa.
Chers amis, tout ce qui est vraiment important dans la vie est simple. Covid-19 veut dire défaillance, crise dans la réaction, dans la réponse de plusieurs organisations internationales, de plusieurs gouvernements, de plusieurs entités publiques et privées. Il faut en retirer les conséquences, les leçons. Ça veut dire plus de respect d'autrui, plus de multilatéralisme, plus de compréhension, solidarité, plus de liberté d'expression et liberté religieuse, mais en même temps de capacité d'action de gouvernement, d'organisations internationales, d'entités publiques et privées, mais de femmes et d'hommes. Il nous faut un autre monde, et un autre monde avec de la paix. Et cette paix est faite de femmes et d'hommes, solidaires, unis, au-delà des divergences et des différences. Nous sommes juste une humanité.
Just picking up on that collection of voices, again, another of the strong themes that we've seen just then, but that we also saw in some of the other speeches that were made by global leaders, is this need not just for a conversation, not just for global action, but actually for solidarity. So there is a call for the world, I suppose, to look at how it manages its resources and the distribution of in a different way. So it is a much broader conversation that we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree, and I heard several of them refer to that. You know, you could see it this way. Our productive system in the last decades has produced what economists refer to as two negative externalities, at least. One was climate, and we mentioned this. Many leaders mentioned climate and global warming as something we should pay attention to. Our productive system is creating too much CO2 emissions. But the second one is the one you just mentioned, that is to say inequalities. Globalization has fostered inequalities. In some country that was buffered by social systems and safety networks, etc. In other countries, the lower classes bore the brunt of the effects of globalization on the social structure. And so it's no wonder that several are alluding to constructing a post-COVID-19 world that would take into account these two externalities, these two unintended and bad consequences of what we've seen.
Because these are conversations that are happening within national borders, as you say. Countries were hit differently according to the kind of systems that they had. And in a sense, the crisis has been a revealer of the strengths and weaknesses of different societies. So these are, of course, conversations having within. It's interesting that everyone appears to be coming to the same conclusion.
Yes, and you know, what's also interesting is that we know that right now, in about 20 minutes or so, we'll go to the Elysee, where President Macron has a number of leaders, both online and in presence, and they will tell us, they will continue the discussion that they have. And I know that this question of social inequalities is one of the issues that they will be tackling. You know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there was this thing called the Washington Consensus, which was a series of principles, some called neoliberal principles, that guided international institutions and many states. They were very disputed, very decried, but they served sort of as a guideline. Well, the crisis in 2008 and also this COVID-19 crisis, I think, have made way for different principles. And that's what leaders at the Elysee right now are discussing, trying to reach a new consensus on principles to guide for the post-COVID-19 world, incorporating climate, for example, social inequalities. What do we do with these global value chains that have been sort of running wild? Certainly they will continue, but should they be so extended as they are now? That's the things that they will be discussing, and I hope we'll have an answer in about 20 minutes from now.
So the idea then that the theory behind how we should organize these conversations, how societies should organize their responses, how they might even structure themselves is part of the conversation, but so too is the concrete actions that can be taken. I think one of the things that was striking when we heard from Narendra Modi was that line about turning illusion to reality. There has been, whatever the theory behind the move together and the move to action that is concerted is, there's also the need at some point to make it real. And when you consider, for instance, something like climate change, we've heard a lot today about the Paris Accord and the renewed push to make it happen. When you consider how long it took, how many summits it took, how many conversations, how many ups and downs between Kyoto and Paris, you realize that these are conversations that happen over the very long time. This time, we're faced with something that needs fixing now. I wonder if both things can go on at the same time.
I agree. It always takes a lot of time. What I'm struck by is that necessity that many proclaim and put forward to work together, and the difficulty in concrete terms to get to an agreement. I mean, 5 years ago, here in Paris, the Paris Agreement, it took a lot of work to get to an agreement which is not even legally binding, even though it has had real normative effects on the conduct of countries, and no country has left it except for the US, at least momentarily. But in a way, you know, we're back to that conclusion. There is no other way. There is no world government, and there will never be a world government, and that's probably for the better. But what we need to do instead is coordinate, right? And that takes leadership. We are back to, and that's why these messages give me hope. We are back to putting our faith in the fact that these leaders will actually coordinate, cooperate, align their policies so we can have a more coherent global policy against the global challenges.
Because one of the immediate lessons of this crisis, presumably, Justin, is that beyond the question of what kind of world we want, the fact of it is that we were simply not prepared to deal with a global crisis like this one. The world was not ready. Hence that immediate retreat to nationalist policies when it came to vaccine procurement. Were you surprised that that should be the reaction?
No, I was indulgent because we know that the first task of these governments is to protect their populations, and that's fine, except that it took a long, long time for them to get out of their shell of only protecting their population, closing borders, and being focused on getting the more masks, the more medical personal equipment, and the more vaccines, to going towards more coordination, which in the long run is indispensable. Because, for example, the world economy will not pick up before we have vaccines for everyone. It will not pick up until some regions are not left out of, or at least picked out of poverty. So this is a necessity not just for generosity and morality, but simply for self-interest.
What are the inherent difficulties, though? I mean, it is precisely at a moment like that that we retreat. That's certainly what's happened. Some of those institutions, the World Health Organization, we know who were there to try and help see the world through and find some kind of coordination, contested by some. It has been an extremely fractured response, and one that, for the time being, has not found that global answer. What is the difficulty? Why is it so hard?
Every government is accountable to its population, and leaders felt that they had to answer this sort of poignant call from their population to act and to make sure that they were doing all that was in their power to respond. The problem, of course, is the articulation between what is in their power and the necessity to see the longer term and to see the collective interest of acting also, and to balance these things. And that's why leadership is so important.
And these conversations as well. We're going to listen to some of those voices who have been leading this conversation, some of those international organizations who are also taking part in today's Paris Peace Forum, to try and bring some clarity to that question of what we should be looking forward to beyond the immediate COVID-19 crisis.
This year's Paris Peace Forum comes in an extraordinary moment.
The vulnerabilities through poverty, climate change, violence, wars, and other challenges in societies tend to be overshadowed by the dominant feature of fighting the pandemic.
As the world starts to slowly recover, our economies, our societies, and our communities have the opportunity to transform their relationships with the environment, restore nature, and take the level of climate action we now need.
Les mesures adoptées pour l'avenir ne riment pas avec arbitraire et exclusion. Et ces mesures ne seront durables et tenables que si elles respectent la démocratie et l'état de droit.
So we need policies that support parental care. We need governments to think about infrastructure for child care that is accessible and affordable as we think about building back better.
To support the most vulnerable among the vulnerables, the migrants. And at the same time, we have been cooperating with the governments and with the associations of civil society.
And our first task must be to protect them so that existing inequalities do not get even worse.
We need to focus on fixing the root causes of inequalities within and between countries. These are not just the smart thing to do, they are the right thing to do.
It is the absolute need for all of us to work together. For businesses, governments, civil society, and workers, all of us to collaborate.
Collective responsibility is exactly what we need if we are serious to address our energy and climate goals.
Now, of all the international organizations involved, none more so really than the World Health Organization, which has thus far been leading the coordination as much as was possible of the world's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's have a listen to Dr. Tedros, the World Health Organization Director General.
Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, the COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented crisis demanding an unprecedented response. Global solidarity and global leadership are needed as never before. In April, WHO and our partners launched the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator to accelerate the development, production, and equitable allocation of new COVID-19 tools. We thank France, Germany, South Africa, Norway, and the European Commission for their leadership in creating the political platform for the ACT Accelerator to succeed. As part of the ACT Accelerator, 186 countries have now signed up to the COVAX facility to ensure that once we have a safe and effective vaccine, it's available to those most at risk in all countries. We have two urgent requests for the international community. First, the ACT Accelerator will be no more than a noble gesture unless it's fully funded. The current financing gap for the ACT Accelerator is $28.5 billion and $4.5 billion is needed urgently to maintain momentum. And second, we must ensure fair allocation of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics as global public goods, not private commodities that become one more reason some people are left behind. To achieve that, we must commit to following the 5 principles of the ACT Accelerator Charter: shared data and knowledge, ensuring health system capacity, fair and transparent pricing, leveraging publicly funded research, and global coordination for equitable allocation. Ending COVID-19 is a scientific and a financial challenge, but it's also a test of character. This is the moment for the world to say no to narrow self-interest and yes to solidarity. I thank you. Merci beaucoup.
So we heard from Dr. Tedros from WHO, but health and the economy were not the only sectors that were impacted. Culture and education were also severely struck, and I suggest we now hear from Audrey Azoulay, the Director General of UNESCO.
À l'heure de la crise provoquée par la pandémie mondiale de Covid-19, il faut refuser la tentation du repli sur soi et investir ensemble pour les biens communs. C'est l'objectif du multilatéralisme tangible, concret, ouvert sur la société et sur le monde, tel que nous le pratiquons ici à l'UNESCO. Un espace mondial pour agir ensemble, un espace indispensable dans cette crise. Quand un tiers de la population mondiale est encore privée d'école, c'est notre devoir commun d'agir pour la continuité de l'éducation. C'est ce que fait l'UNESCO, avec la Coalition mondiale pour l'éducation. Quand une information vérifiée peut sauver une vie, soutenir le travail des journalistes est plus que jamais notre responsabilité à tous. Comme l'est celle de soutenir le secteur culturel dans toute sa diversité, quand la culture rouvre les horizons et nous permet de faire société. C'est notre responsabilité aussi d'investir plus et mieux dans la coopération scientifique, partager les fruits de la recherche, se fonder sur une science ouverte, mettre aussi la technologie et notamment l'intelligence artificielle au service du bien commun. Pour cela, il faut des standards internationaux et c'est l'enjeu des instruments normatifs que l'UNESCO prépare sur la science ouverte, sur l'éthique de l'intelligence artificielle avec ses États membres. Construire ensemble, pour le bien commun, voilà le projet du multilatéralisme. Il nous permet selon les mots du philosophe sénégalais Souleymane Bachir Ndiaye, de tirer les leçons de la dévastation pour refonder le monde selon une politique d'humanité.
The view there from UNESCO. There is, of course, also how this pandemic has affected our societies, our economies. Let's have a listen now to the Director General of the OECD, Angel Gurria.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I am delighted to join the third edition of the Paris Peace Forum. Now, we are in the midst of an unprecedented global public health, economic, and social crisis. Years of development progress are at risk of being erased. The urgency of climate change continues. And as we enter the decade of action, many nations are falling behind on their SDG targets. In our complex, interconnected, fragile world, multilateralism is more needed than ever. First, we need global rules on vaccines and their procurement to ensure equitable access, affordability, and supply for all countries. Second, we must focus on rebuilding our economies, rebuilding our societies in a more inclusive and environmentally sustainable manner, to empower the vulnerable, to empower women. Third, we need stronger international cooperation to help countries rebuild their public finances, including through the G20. The OECD's evidence-based analysis continues facilitating coordinated policy responses across countries. We must all play our part to build back better.
We have one last leader to listen to, and this is Louise Mushikiwabo, the Secretary General of the, and I will say it in French, l'Organisation mondiale de la francophonie.
En cette période de pandémie, un devoir s'impose à nous, refonder la coopération internationale. 4 priorités me paraissent essentielles pour le court et le long terme. Premièrement, la crise sanitaire nous rappelle que la santé, son accès garanti à toutes et tous, est une priorité absolue. Alors que la course au vaccin contre la Covid-19 continue, je me joins à l'appel à en faire un bien public mondial, accessible à tous, sans restriction quelconque. Deuxièmement, nous devons remettre en route l'économie mondiale. Cela ne se fera pas sans tous nos pays. C'est pourquoi nous devons œuvrer à réduire le poids de la dette qui affecte les États les plus fragiles. La prolongation du moratoire sur son remboursement est une bonne chose. À plus long terme, il faut envisager sa restructuration. Les ressources rendues disponibles permettront une relance ambitieuse, s'appuyant notamment sur les femmes, particulièrement touchées par la crise, et dont la résilience sera essentielle à notre relèvement. Troisièmement, nous devons réparer les dommages causés par la pandémie à nos démocraties, déjà fragilisées depuis de nombreuses années. La crise a accru la défiance à l'égard des institutions, les infodémies n'en étant qu'un des signes les plus patents. Renouveler le contrat social entre les gouvernements et leur population est un impératif. Enfin, nous devons reconstruire un nouveau modèle de développement. Un modèle qui, sans remettre en cause la dynamique des échanges internationaux, renforce la capacité des nations à assurer leur approvisionnement en certains biens et services jugés stratégiques, qui limite les inégalités et offre des filets de sécurité aux plus vulnérables, qui intègre pleinement, car nous n'avons pas le choix, l'impératif climatique et environnemental. Pour tout cela, nous avons besoin d'un sursaut de coopération internationale. La plupart des problèmes auxquels nous faisons face sont des problèmes globaux qui appellent des solutions globales. L'urgence est de bâtir un multilatéralisme rénové, renforcé, efficace. Au-delà des mots, il faut agir et la francophonie, avec ses 88 États et gouvernements membres, prendra toute sa part à ce renouveau.
The former Foreign Affairs Minister of Rwanda there, of course, who is now the head of the OIF. We're just going to take you over in a moment to the Elysee for that session we mentioned a moment ago. Just before we do, though, Justin, I want to pick up on what was just said, and that idea that reinforced multilateralism, turning words into action, that plea that we heard just there at the end. Has the problem so far been a question of the kinds of structure we have? Do we need new global structures in order to bring about these concrete actions? Or is it simply a question of using the structures that exist already better than we have so far?
Honestly, I don't think we need new structures. And what's more, I don't think we would be able, in a position, to create new structures. The international system is such that it would be really hard if we destroyed current institutions to rebuild new ones. And so I think the only way is to encourage leaders to use these institutions. After all, the WHO, like the UN, are just in the hands of states. When we say, oh, the UN is not effective, or WHO has been miserable at doing this or that, the persons we are blaming are actually the countries, the states who are forming, who are giving instructions to these international organizations. And so what it means is that political power still resides in the hands of individual countries, and they must do more to use these multilateral organizations, I would say, to their benefit, because at the end of the day, it's good to posture about imposing your will, your country first, etc. But in the end, we all lose when we don't use these multilateral organizations.
One of the themes that has come back over and over again in everything we've heard so far from both the international organizations, Justin, and the global leaders that have taken part that we've been hearing the voices of so far is that idea that, this crisis should also be an opportunity. And that is true, of course, in terms of the form of this forum. This is the installation that you've created here allows 12,000 people across the world to be connected at any given time, to interact with one another. It is the first time that anything like this has been put together digitally to answer that immediate question of how you were going to get all these people together.
Absolutely. I think it's a first. And so we've been forced by the COVID-19 to retreat to the digital world. I think we've built a great tool for that coordination. We're also tackling, on substance, we're also tackling many issues like infodemics, like cyber insecurity, like the protection of private data, and other things. We have moved online, and the problems have followed us there. And here again, coordination is called for. And so that's what we are trying to do at the Paris Peace Forum year after year, to bring all the actors together, the states, the companies, the foundations, the NGOs, private citizens, everybody, so we tackle these challenges.
And of course, in a way that is technically so different from anything that's been done before. In fact, what you're going to see in a short while when we go to the Elysee Live is an insight into diplomacy that we often don't have. So it has been also an opportunity in that sense. In the end, thanks to the technological tools that we have today, thanks to the fact of this crisis forcing us to think again about how we meet and how we coordinate, perhaps there is something positive to be said about this mode of getting people together.
Yeah, I think one of the ideas that especially Kristalina Georgieva and President Macron had was not only to think about the world of tomorrow, what principles should we rebuild the post-COVID-19 world on, but also that this type of diplomacy should be conducted more in public than we used to. People are fed up of thinking that leaders are always behind closed doors and would never share or explain or account for what they are doing. And so what we hope we will have in a few minutes when we go live to the Elysee is this sort of opening to the public, conducting diplomacy in public. Of course, it's not possible to conduct diplomacy completely in public, but there's more we can do, and I think we'll have a good example of that.
And it's something that we heard over and over again in those messages as well, Justin, was the idea that transparency also is key, that perhaps these conversations have happened behind closed doors. And one can imagine that perhaps because this is a crisis that touches so many people personally, there will be an actual desire to see what's being done that there will be more appetite from people for that transparency and more determination on the part of leaders to deliver it. I mean, in a sense, this kind of pandemic that has so separated us has also brought together or allowed our different interests and ambitions and hopes to converge.
Yes, and I think that's what they will express. The original idea was to really try to have North and South, Europe and Africa, but also the other continents, trying to get together, to bang their heads together and try to say, okay, we've been hit by this crisis really hard. Let's try to reach a consensus on how do we get out of the crisis, vaccines, recovery, relaunching a green recovery, and relaunching the economy, but also on which principles we will build this post-COVID-19 world. Let's try to reach a new consensus to crystallize so then we can have a more effective international system.
I'd like, before we head to the Elysee in a bit, just to talk to you about one of those very concrete and immediate concerns, which is, of course, the vaccine that everyone's been talking about this week more than even before, Justin, because suddenly we have this perspective of some hope that a vaccine will be found. And, of course, the immediate question of how to get it to people when it is expensive, when it is difficult to keep or to transport or to organize, you know, how logistically that's going to be fixed. For the time being, we've seen countries like the United States and Europe acquire doses of these vaccines. How will we concretely now make sure that they get to those people that need them?
The announcement by Pfizer that they had a working vaccine, of course, raised considerable hope. Of course, when we look closer, we see that it's a very expensive vaccine and that it needs to be preserved under very strict conditions of cold, minus 80 degrees. And so we need to go further. But more importantly, we need to make sure that everybody can get the vaccine. And that will be the issue at 5:30 when we reconvene. There will be an announcement on what financial means together we can devote to that, because until every country is vaccinated, no country will be safe from coronavirus and no country will be in a good spot economically.
And of course, it is the only solution that there will be. You've spoken about it at national levels. Of course, society is realizing that even in their different healthcare models, it was essential that everyone was able to be protected. And that happens, of course, globally. I think one of the interesting things about this pandemic also is that if you recall in its very beginning, when it was still largely an Asian problem, Justin, the whole world had thought, but what if it reaches those parts of the world that are poorest or don't have the necessary infrastructure? In fact, it is the world's wealthiest countries that it hit hardest, in a sense, and really brought a global economy to its knees. So there has been a leveling out, in a sense, of vulnerability.
It's true, even though some low and medium income countries were struck too. Yesterday we had a really interesting panel on Africa and COVID-19. How does Africa respond to COVID-19? It has been relatively less affected by COVID-19, also because they've taken really good measures about it. But we had Tidjane Thiam and a couple of other leaders representing the African Union trying to explain what measures they were putting in place to protect these. But of course, the larger question will be how we actually get these vaccines to the populations that need them. So we need robust vaccines, we need vaccines that will not cost too much, and we need, more importantly, global coordination, a far cry from the vaccine nationalism that we've seen until now.
And so concretely, how might that be organized? By whom might that be organized?
You know, it's a really interesting question, because it's the question of the Paris Peace Forum. That is to say, from the start, from 2018, the Paris Peace Forum was all about getting states, foundation, philanthropic foundation, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust, for example, companies, you know, big pharma, but also NGOs and also development agencies, development banks together in order to do that. And there's an initiative called ACT-A, Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, that was launched in March, April of this year, and that which purpose is precisely to make these tools available: diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And what we'll have at 5:30 later today at the Paris Peace Forum is a sort of a new impetus, I should say, for that ACT-A initiative, both in terms of political principles and in terms of financial resources. Dr. Tedros from WHO a bit earlier said we still lacked about $30 billion over the next few years. We'll do a step this afternoon. There will be more than $500 million that will be announced just a couple of hours from now at the Paris Peace Forum. And also initiatives by foundations and by labs to provide these vaccines and get them to the populations that need them.
One of the surprising things, I think, when one looks back at this pandemic is that it should have taken everyone by surprise as it did. In a sense, when you look back at how globalized the world is de facto, how people live, how they travel, the many thousands of flights that there were between Asia, Europe, the United States, all different parts of the world, it's almost surprising and naive of us to have imagined that this wouldn't happen somehow. Is it simply that we have an ability as human beings to live one reality, but lag behind in terms of what politically we need to accompany that? In a sense, that's what's been put into stark opposition by this crisis.
You know, it's almost a philosophical answer that I'd like to give. It is that even if you are able to anticipate and to do the best prediction there is, you don't have the resources that a crisis triggers before the crisis hits. Yes. And even though we knew about this, remember this video by Bill Gates in 2015, we knew that it could strike, but it was still very difficult to get the resources, the attention, the political capital to fight this or to prepare for this. And it had to take the actual triggering of the crisis to be able to release billions of dollars in stimulus and this incredible scientific effort that we've seen around vaccines.
That does, of course, mean that countries have had to, take this on in a way that perhaps they hadn't imagined they would have to. It was said of the European Union at its foundation, Justin, that it would be built on the back of the crises that hit it. I wonder if this is also one of those moments, perhaps, when the crisis will test what happens next.
That's a good question, but I think we are now ready to go to the Élysée.
We're going to take you to that live session now, hosted by the French President, Emmanuel Macron.
Oui. Oui, bonjour à toutes et tous. J'espère que nous sommes connectés avec l'ensemble des participants au Forum de Paris pour la paix. Et merci d'être là. Pardon, nous vous avons fait attendre. Je suis ici au Palais de l'Élysée avec le président Macky Sall, le président Charles Michel et la directrice générale du FMI, Kristalina Georgieva. Et nous avions à l'instant un échange avec la chancelière Merkel, la présidente Ursula von der Leyen et le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Antonio Guterres. Heureux de vous retrouver donc pour cette 3e édition du Forum de Paris pour la paix. Et merci à tous les chefs d'État de gouvernement, dirigeants d'organisations internationales, dirigeants d'organisations non gouvernementales, fondations, entreprises, élus, dirigeants et citoyennes et citoyens qui sont réunis aujourd'hui, malheureusement virtuellement. C'est la 3e édition de ce Forum de Paris pour la paix que nous avions lancé au moment du centenaire de la fin du premier conflit mondial pour chercher justement à ne pas faire bégayer l'histoire, mais à bâtir ensemble les réponses utiles de notre monde. Ça n'a rien à voir avec l'existence du forum, mais force est de constater que depuis 3 ans, la vie est encore plus dure. Nous avons eu, depuis maintenant presque 1 an, une pandémie qui s'est abattue de manière inédite sur le monde, cette Covid-19 qui nous empêche de nous voir physiquement aujourd'hui et qui change nos vies. Le terrorisme s'est remis à frapper durement en Europe et ailleurs, encore hier sur le continent africain. Les tensions sont extrêmes et les défis que nous avions évoqués à plusieurs reprises sont là pour nous rappeler, au fond, la complexité des problèmes qui sont les nôtres. Et ces défis arrivent, s'ajoutent aux défis que nous connaissons depuis maintenant plusieurs années et décennies, défis climatiques, défis des inégalités qui est lié à l'épuisement, au dérèglement de notre modèle économique et financier. Tous ces défis, parfois liés les uns aux autres, impliquent au fond davantage de coopération internationale. Et ils adviennent à un moment où notre multilatéralisme est extrêmement fragilisé, soit parce que de nouvelles puissances régionales émergent avec des agendas, des objectifs qui ne sont plus compatibles avec celui-ci, soit parce que nous avons collectivement fragilisé ce multilatéralisme en faisant parfois l'otage de nos intérêts particuliers ou de nos désaccords. Et donc beaucoup de choses sont à reconstruire parce que nous n'avons jamais été aussi interdépendants. Au fond, les destins d'un habitant de Rio, Lagos, Canberra, Vienne, Paris, Dakar n'ont jamais été si liés qu'aujourd'hui. Par le commerce, par le numérique, par les consciences et le rôle que les réseaux sociaux jouent, les conséquences du dérèglement climatique. Et donc c'est pour nous, je crois, un défi encore plus important qu'hier. Et je crois que notre volonté, c'est véritablement d'essayer d'engager une nouvelle étape. C'est la discussion que nous venons d'avoir à l'instant avec l'ensemble des dirigeants que j'ai évoqués et d'autres dirigeants que nous avons engagés dans notre réflexion. Au fond, nous sommes convaincus que nous avons aujourd'hui besoin de bâtir un nouveau consensus. Et quand je dis consensus, ce n'est pas une espèce de point d'équilibre mou ou complaisant, mais nous dire, face à ces défis, nous devons nous mettre d'accord sur une même lecture du monde. Et de le faire entre pays développés, pays en voie de développement, pays émergents, quels que soient les niveaux de développement économique, financiers et sociaux, parce que ces défis sont les mêmes pour tous, et qu'on ne peut pas réussir sur chacun des défis que je viens de rappeler les uns sans les autres. Et notre volonté, c'est de bâtir ce nouveau consensus par un dialogue qui commence aujourd'hui, mais qui doit se poursuivre pour nous dans les prochaines semaines et les prochains mois. Nous signerons une tribune commune, à quelques-uns ici présents, plus d'autres chefs d'État que nous avons impliqués, et chefs de gouvernement, mais notre volonté, c'est de poursuivre ce travail qui doit impliquer les entreprises, les académiques, les ONG, pour bâtir en quelque sorte cette grille de lecture commune du moment. Et pour moi, le fait que Macky Sall soit présent ici, que nous ayons entre autres aussi Cyril Ramaphosa dans les signataires, c'est aussi une façon de dire que la réponse à ces défis du XXIe siècle passe par une alliance historique entre l'Afrique et l'Europe, avec la volonté ensuite de convaincre évidemment tous les continents. Mais cette volonté commune de l'Afrique et de l'Europe, ensemble en même temps, avec les mêmes exigences, les mêmes droits, est absolument essentielle. Autour de questions qui ont la force de l'évidence, mais que nous avons mis trop de temps à affronter réellement et collectivement, on doit réussir à bâtir, au fond, ce consensus, et autour de quelques questions dont nous venons de débattre. Comment garantir effectivement l'accès universel aux moyens de lutte contre notre pandémie? C'est le premier défi. Nous avons lancé, dès le début de la crise, cette initiative Acte A, autour de l'OMS, mais avec justement plusieurs pays, avec la puissance de feu du G20, et aussi de forces régionales, non gouvernementales, du secteur privé. On a COVAX, justement, qui a aussi permis de mobiliser des moyens. Mais comment être sûr et certain que tout le monde joue le jeu, qu'il n'y a pas de comportement de passagers clandestins, qu'on produira suffisamment de doses pour les pays les plus pauvres qui en auront le plus besoin, parce qu'on ne gagnera pas contre le virus en abandonnant une partie de l'humanité. Et sinon, ça renforcerait encore nos inégalités et ça bloquerait le développement de tous. Et donc, comment garantir que c'est un bien public mondial? Comment garantir la bonne production? Et comment en même temps s'assurer qu'on continue d'accélérer notre bataille commune pour les systèmes de soins primaires, parce qu'on ne peut pas diffuser des vaccins ou des traitements, parce qu'on jouera sur les deux tableaux, sans système de soins primaires consolidé. Deuxième grande question, comment être dans la réalité et pas les mots, à hauteur des ambitions que nous nous étions données il y a 5 ans en adoptant l'accord de Paris sur le climat, alors même que chacun de nos pays se bat contre une crise sanitaire, économique et sociale d'une ampleur inouïe. Notre conviction, je crois pouvoir le dire, c'est que, au fond, la bataille dans le virus et après le virus, la reconquête, la relance économique doit être une refondation par la transformation écologique et la réponse aux défis du climat et de la biodiversité. Et donc, le défi qui est le nôtre, c'est comment accélérer justement les financements qui le permettent, les transformations. Et je veux vraiment remercier la directrice générale du FMI, chère Kristalina, pour les solutions innovantes qui sont proposées, qu'on soutiendra. Président Michel aussi, parce que l'Europe a décidé, au-delà du fonds de relance, d'innover dans sa propre structuration financière. Et je pense que c'est très important qu'on invente de nouvelles formules et qu'on ait encore plus d'ambition budgétaire, monétaire et financière dans ce moment pour accélérer cette transition verte, avec des échéances qu'on connaît sur 2021, évidemment le moment de vérité que nous aurons en fin d'année, début d'année prochaine sur nos objectifs 2030, le dialogue indispensable que nous aurons entre Européens, puis avec la Chine, avec la nouvelle administration américaine, et les rendez-vous de la biodiversité en début d'année et du sommet de Glasgow, évidemment, dans le courant de l'année 2021. Troisième grande question, c'est comment transformer les règles de la mondialisation contemporaine pour répondre à l'explosion sans précédent des inégalités. Et là, on le voit très clairement, les inégalités se font au sein de nos pays, entre générations. Notre commerce, l'ouverture de nos économies est menacée par les extrêmes dans nos pays, le doute qui s'est installé, ce que nous a fait vivre aussi la pandémie et cette expérience de vulnérabilité que nous avons tous eue. Comment rebâtir un commerce international qui soit plus juste, qui réponde à ces inégalités dans nos pays et à l'étranger, un commerce international qui prenne en compte nos objectifs climatiques également, parce qu'on ne peut pas définir des règles, poser des contraintes à nos acteurs et faire comme si de rien n'était quand on négocie ces règles à l'international. C'est un défi clé qui doit être au cœur de ce nouveau consensus. Et puis enfin, comment défendre les valeurs universelles et les droits fondamentaux proclamés dans la Charte au XXIe siècle face à un recul historique partout dans le monde. Et de la même manière que le multilatéralisme est fragilisé, l'universalité de nos valeurs est aujourd'hui bousculée par des discours de haine, par une habitude en quelque sorte aux faits terroristes. Et là-dessus, il faut non seulement le condamner, mais réussir à créer un ordre public mondial conforme à nos valeurs dans les réseaux sociaux et l'interpénétration de nos imaginaires, et réussir à continuer à défendre cette universalité des valeurs. Et ça, c'est un travail que nous avons commencé avec l'appel de Christchurch, dans cette salle même, il y a 1 an et demi, que nous devons poursuivre. On le poursuit au niveau européen avec le travail qui est fait au Parlement et bientôt autour de la table du Conseil, mais c'est un travail qui doit se faire à l'international, et le partenariat là aussi afro-européen est absolument essentiel. Voilà quelques-uns des grands axes que je voulais rappeler, et au fond je vais maintenant céder la parole à mes collègues, mais vous le voyez bien, ce sont des défis immenses, et nous nous les posons alors même que nous gérons l'urgence dans nos sociétés. Mais nous avons la conviction que c'est à cette condition qu'on pourra bâtir une réponse durable aux défis qui sont les nôtres. Nul ne sait dire quand la pandémie s'arrêtera, ni quand le terrorisme sera vaincu. Et donc nous ne pouvons pas attendre d'avoir mené ces guerres de l'urgence pour rebâtir ces fondamentaux qui permettront de mieux les prévenir. Au fond, le moment est venu en quelque sorte d'inverser l'ordre des termes que Charles Dickens employait sur la Révolution. Il écrivait « c'était la pire des époques, c'était la meilleure des époques ». On a un peu goûté du pire cette année, et il nous faut tout faire pour que l'année 2021 nous permette, face à ces défis, de tous devoir bouger plus vite. Et donc on le fera avec toutes les femmes et les hommes de bonne volonté, organisations internationales, gouvernements, mais aussi ONG, think tank, chercheurs, entreprises, citoyens, parce qu'on est convaincu que c'est dans la pluralité de cette capacité à agir que nous aurons une réponse. Et donc, c'est une conversation que nous commençons aujourd'hui. Elle va se poursuivre et je souhaite que vous puissiez tous contribuer, répondre, que nous puissions vous lire, qu'il puisse y avoir un travail à la fois intellectuel et doctrinal, mais aussi de mise en pratique très concrète qu'on avait commencé l'année dernière avec le B4IG et beaucoup d'autres initiatives, mais qu'on puisse continuer à la fois démontrer que les choses sont en train de changer, que notre système bouge, et continuer de le penser, de le réinventer. Voilà ce que je voulais dire pour essayer de rendre grâce de manière synthétique à nos échanges, et je vais donner maintenant la parole au président Macky Sall.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur le président Emmanuel Macron, c'est pour la consommation extérieure. Mais merci, cher Emmanuel, pour cette opportunité que tu nous offres. Nous avons eu un échange très dynamique tout à l'heure avec les collègues Christonina ainsi que Charles Michel et tous les autres qui ont été dans ce débat. Et vous avez bien brossé le sujet dans sa globalité, que ce soit sur les questions de santé mondiale avec la pandémie de Covid-19, qui est une pandémie commune au monde entier aujourd'hui, avec nos vulnérabilités communes et nos fragilités communes, mais aussi la nécessaire solidarité entre États et au sein des États. Vous avez parlé aussi d'un sujet d'actualité criard, c'est le sujet sur le climat et la biodiversité, qui mérite la mobilisation de tout le monde pour l'application de l'accord de Paris. Et il y va de la survie de notre planète. C'est-à-dire que tout le monde doit prendre conscience que si nous n'agissons pas maintenant, eh bien, nous allons voir, en tout cas, notre planète, sinon disparaître, du moins nous révéler des manifestations que nous n'avons jamais connues jusqu'ici. Et nous en avons déjà des exemples très patents. Ensuite, il y a la question du commerce, de l'économie mondiale, la question de l'investissement, de l'accès au crédit, en particulier pour les pays en développement, la question du numérique, et celle de la défense des valeurs communes ou des valeurs partagées. Alors, moi, je voudrais choisir juste un exemple et développer un peu sur la question de l'inclusion. Puisque l'inclusion, pour moi, c'est d'abord un facteur de paix sociale. Au sein des nations, au sein de chaque pays, à l'intérieur de chaque pays, il faut qu'il y ait une politique de justice sociale, d'équité sociale et territoriale, pour d'abord limiter les inégalités, les injustices. C'est un facteur de stabilité, à la fois nationale et internationale. Quand on voit les phénomènes dans les pays, en particulier africains, où l'exode rural a été la première manifestation au sein des nations avant qu'elle ne devienne une question de migration clandestine aujourd'hui, parce que les gens, après avoir fait la première migration vers les capitales, qui sont sur les côtes, aujourd'hui c'est une tendance tout à fait nouvelle et assez préoccupante vers des destinations européennes et autres. Alors cela nécessite bien entendu une prise en charge d'abord des États. C'est notre responsabilité première de créer les conditions de donner de la formation, de donner de l'emploi, même si ce n'est pas que l'emploi salarié qui ne peut pas prendre en charge les besoins de l'emploi en Afrique. Mais il faut également que la solidarité et l'inclusion, cette fois-ci entre les États, puissent jouer pour apporter des solutions durables. Dans le cas du Sénégal, depuis 2014, j'ai lancé quelques politiques d'inclusion. Je voulais juste dire comment ça s'est produit. C'est d'abord ce que j'ai appelé la politique d'équité, une équité sociale et territoriale, puisque nous avons traduit cette politique d'équité en termes d'accès à des services sociaux de base, mais dans les territoires, à l'intérieur. L'accès à l'eau potable, l'accès universel également à l'électricité, l'accès à la mobilité collective, donc les pistes de désenclavement pour faciliter les productions, les zones de production vers les zones de marché, mais aussi le désenclavement tout simplement. Et enfin, une quatrième dimension qui est l'allègement des travaux domestiques des femmes en milieu rural. Jusqu'à présent, dans certaines parties du monde, les femmes utilisent la force musculaire pour moudre les grains, pour aller chercher du bois de chauffe, pour, disons, quotidiennement, travailler durement. Alors, il faut des machines, il faut des moulins à mil, il faut, etc., etc. Ça, c'est un programme que j'avais bâti autour de ce que j'ai appelé un programme d'urgence de développement communautaire en faveur de zones déshéritées et éloignées. De la même façon, les zones frontalières qui sont les plus réceptives au terrorisme et au discours, puisque ce sont des territoires abandonnés en général, éloignés, qui n'ont accès ni à l'eau, ni à l'électricité, ni aux soins de santé. Alors, sur ces zones aussi de vulnérabilité territoriale, il a fallu développer des programmes vraiment d'inclusion pour pouvoir éviter que ces territoires ne tombent aussi sous l'emprise du terrorisme ou en tout cas de bataille communautaire. Il y a ce que j'ai appelé également la carte d'égalité des chances. Cette carte d'égalité des chances a été développée pour des personnes vivant avec des handicaps, que ce soit des handicaps moteurs, de motricité ou d'autres. Nous leur avons donné accès à la couverture maladie universelle, qui est un accès à des soins de santé pris en charge par l'État. Nous avons également donné des gratuités pour tous les enfants de moins de 5 ans sur les programmes élargis de vaccination, mais également toutes les personnes au-delà de 60 ans, puisqu'en Afrique, 60 ans, c'était un âge très avancé. Donc, ils ont accès également à certaines gratuités et la prise en charge gratuite des cancers féminins, puisque ça fait ravage aussi en Afrique. Et la prise en charge de la chimiothérapie, par exemple, aujourd'hui, pour les cancers féminins est gratuite au Sénégal. Et l'idée, c'est de le rendre gratuit pour les autres types de cancers quand on n'a pas un système de sécurité sociale très moderne. Alors pour moi, l'inclusion, c'est tout cela, c'est aussi, surtout, le financement rapide des femmes et des jeunes pour l'entrepreneuriat. Et l'entrepreneuriat doit être un mot-clé dans ce que nous devons faire pour l'inclusion. Puisque les États ne peuvent pas donner suffisamment d'emplois, même les entreprises ne peuvent pas donner suffisamment d'emplois par rapport à la demande. Il faut que l'auto-emploi, que l'entrepreneuriat soit vraiment élevé à un niveau de culte pour que les mentalités changent et que, quel que soit le métier, qu'on puisse donner de la formation, de l'éducation, mais aussi les possibilités d'avoir accès à un crédit, surtout pour les femmes, mais aussi pour les jeunes. Alors, je n'en dirai pas plus parce que les femmes africaines en particulier méritent d'être citées un exemple par leur apport dans l'économie familiale, par leur apport dans l'économie nationale, même si ce n'est pas valorisé parce que c'est du travail informel en général. Et je plaide pour que dans les financements à venir, que l'accès au crédit pour les femmes et pour les jeunes puisse avoir une part prépondérante afin de vraiment lutter véritablement contre la pauvreté et contre les disparités. Enfin, je voudrais au plan international maintenant, pour revenir à ce que Emmanuel a dit, il nous faut une humanité commune, il nous faut travailler vers des plateformes communes. Moi, je suis tout à fait confiant que nous pouvons partager des valeurs. Je ne suis pas dans du scepticisme. Seulement, nous avons besoin aussi d'étendre le spectre de la discussion, de tenir compte des réalités des uns et des autres pour bâtir des valeurs communes. C'est tout à fait possible et ça demande simplement, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, qu'il y ait non seulement de l'humilité, en sachant que nous n'avons pas forcément les mêmes valeurs, c'est évident. Moi, je suis africain, vous êtes européen, on n'est pas les mêmes. Mais on peut partager certaines valeurs. On est différents, mais on peut être ensemble. Moi, c'est ça. Il faut que nous acceptions les différences, mais que nous allions ensemble vers ce que nous voulons bâtir en commun. C'est comme ça que je vois, en tout cas, la plateforme qui pourra nous permettre de combattre ensemble tous ceux qui sont contre ces valeurs communes que nous pouvons développer et qui se nourrissent de la haine et du discours qui veut créer un discours hégémonique pour justifier justement leur forfait en utilisant la religion, alors que l'islam d'ailleurs est la première victime. Parce que venez trouver des gens en train de prier dans une mosquée, vous mettez une bombe pour les tuer, on ne peut pas appeler ça de l'islam. Ou venir dans une église, tuer des fidèles catholiques, alors que le prophète Mohammed, pendant qu'il était à Médine, a hébergé dans sa mosquée des gens qui étaient en quête de zones de prière. On ne peut pas dire que l'islam, en tout cas l'islam que nous connaissons nous au Sénégal, qui est un islam de tolérance, que nous assumons, ne peut pas aller dans cette direction. Mais nous voulons aussi qu'il y ait de la tolérance vis-à-vis de l'islam tolérante. Bien combattre le terrorisme, nous sommes ensemble au Mali, nous sommes ensemble dans beaucoup de théâtres. Il faut que nous battions ensemble contre ces extrémismes, mais il faut aussi qu'on respecte la différence. Pour juste pouvoir parler avec les autres communautés, parce que tout le monde n'est pas au même niveau de compréhension, tout le monde voilà, n'a pas la même compréhension des phénomènes et des sujets. Ainsi va le monde. Quand il est midi à Paris, il est peut-être 13h à Beijing, je ne sais pas. Il est encore 7h du matin à Washington. C'est comme ça le monde. De la même façon, les gens sont différents. Ils ne sont pas les mêmes. Des noirs, des jaunes, des blancs, il y a du tout. Donc, mais nous devons quand même malgré tout bâtir nos identités communes et bâtir les valeurs communes qui peuvent nous permettre d'être ensemble, Emmanuel. Et je pense que c'est possible sur l'essentiel. Sur la démocratie, sur les droits de l'homme, tout le monde est d'accord qu'il faut respecter l'intégrité physique des personnes, qu'il faut respecter les droits des êtres humains, il faut respecter les lois de la démocratie, etc., etc. Tenons compte simplement sur d'autres sujets de ce que chaque État est, de comment il réagit et de comment ces populations peuvent réagir. Mais je reste en tout cas très optimiste sur l'avenir du monde. Seulement, il y a des parties du monde qui n'étaient pas là en 1945, qu'elles étaient sous colonie. Et nous n'étions pas là quand on formait les Nations Unies. Donc les règles qui sont là, qui gouvernent les Nations Unies, ne sont pas dans notre intérêt. C'est ça, objectivement. Toute l'Afrique, 54 États, aucun n'est membre du Conseil, membre permanent du Conseil de sécurité. Mais c'est une injustice. Aucun. Alors que l'essentiel de l'agenda, c'est l'Afrique. Les conflits en Afrique, les maladies, le terrorisme en Afrique, on n'est pas présent. Bon, on fait des rotations chacun 2 ans, etc. Ce n'est pas juste. Il faut que nous osions, avec vous, remettre en cause ces règles qui sont dépassées, tout simplement, parce qu'elles ont fait leur temps, ça fait 70 ans. Peut-être l'humanité faisait 2 milliards, 3 milliards. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes 7 milliards. Il y a plus de 2 milliards, 5 milliards qui n'ont aucune représentation. Au Fonds monétaire, la directrice générale vient de le dire. Notre participation, elle est marginale. C'est vraiment la portion congrue. Parce qu'au moment de contribuer, nous n'avons pas les moyens de contribuer. Pour autant, je salue l'idée d'Emmanuel et de Charles, qui consiste à dire les pays qui peuvent se passer de ces ressources, parce qu'ils ont d'autres capacités, peuvent permettre que leurs droits de tirage spéciaux puissent servir, comme dans une mutuelle, à aider les autres qui en ont aujourd'hui besoin. Et c'est ça l'inclusion, la solidarité. En tout cas, je voudrais m'arrêter là pour accompagner et saluer vraiment cette réflexion que le Forum de Paris sur la paix nous permet d'avoir et de bâtir ensemble un avenir radieux dans la solidarité et dans l'inclusion.
Merci, Président. Merci, cher Macky. Je vais donner la parole maintenant au Président du Conseil européen, M. Charles Michel. Cher Charles.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président et très chers amis. C'est évidemment un plaisir pour moi, un honneur pour moi d'être présent ici aujourd'hui. Et je voudrais commencer par remercier et saluer pas seulement l'implication, mais l'action sans relâche du président français pour être engagé, afin de faire en sorte que le monde tente de résister, d'anticiper, de se mobiliser quand on fait face à des défis globaux. Et ces échanges sont utiles, sont nécessaires. Quelques réflexions pour ce qui me concerne. D'abord, premier point, le siècle passé a été marqué par 2 guerres absolument tragiques, mondiales. Et puis après ces guerres tragiques mondiales, il y a eu une lumière d'espoir au travers de la décision de quelques leaders politiques de tenter de bâtir un modèle multilatéral. Imparfait certes, qui prenait en considération le contexte de l'époque, mais qui a visé à mettre ensemble, dans le cadre des Nations Unies, dans le cadre de l'Union européenne, dans le cadre d'autres organisations, les différents pays du monde pour tenter de faire reculer la tentation du repli sur soi, du nationalisme, de l'individualisme des peuples, mais au contraire pour tenter de considérer qu'il y a des défis, la paix, la prospérité, la sécurité qui doivent nous mobiliser ensemble. Et ma conviction, c'est que cette pandémie, elle révèle de façon brutale, de façon douloureuse même, un certain nombre d'enjeux qui étaient devant nous avant la pandémie et qui amènent notre génération, pas seulement politique, mais la génération sur le plan économique, citoyenne, les sociétés civiles, à se poser les bonnes questions et à tenter d'y apporter les bonnes réponses pour agir ensemble. Et donc merci de nous permettre, dans un moment tel que celui-ci, de prendre le temps ensemble, de réfléchir, d'échanger et de tenter d'agir ensemble. Quelques réflexions. 1, s'agissant de la pandémie, le président Macron l'a très bien expliqué, nous sommes très mobilisés, très engagés pour faire en sorte qu'on puisse coopérer de manière concrète sur le terrain des vaccins. C'est très important qu'il y ait là un bien commun afin que dans les prochains mois, on puisse démontrer que notre coopération, elle permettra, je l'espère, en 1 an à peine, ce qui est peu, non seulement de développer des vaccins, de les produire, alors qu'habituellement il faut pratiquement 10 ans en général pour produire des vaccins. Ça montre cette ambition, cet engagement. Il y a encore du pain sur la planche, on va rester engagé. Deuxième point, j'ai formulé tout à l'heure l'idée, je la reprends ici, peut-être devons-nous aller au-delà et tirer les leçons de cette pandémie qui nous frappe. Et c'est pour ça que nous sommes prêts à appeler à la mise en place d'un traité international sur les pandémies, pour qu'il y ait un engagement international plus fort pour prévenir les pandémies. On voit que c'est nécessaire, c'est indispensable, mais aussi, quand on y est confronté, à pouvoir agir plus vite, de façon plus rapide, de façon plus coordonnée, pour garantir qu'il y ait des équipements médicaux, qu'il y ait la capacité d'échanger très vite les informations les uns avec les autres, afin de faire en sorte que l'on protège mieux nos citoyens. C'est un premier point que je voulais mentionner, cette question de la pandémie, et quelques remarques afin d'agir et de réagir. Deuxième point, je ne veux pas être très long par rapport à cela, nous avons abordé cette conviction. Avant la pandémie, nous savions que le changement climatique est un enjeu pour le monde, pour la planète, et nous voyons avec cette pandémie à quel point cette analyse-là est juste et à quel point on doit être mobilisé au travers des investissements pour soutenir des capacités de transformer nos modèles de développement, de production, de consommation. On est tous dans le même bateau par rapport à cela, pas simplement les gouvernements dans les différents pays du monde, c'est aussi le rôle des sociétés civiles, des citoyens, des entreprises, les petites, les grandes, d'être mobilisés ensemble. L'Union européenne veut assumer sa part. C'est ainsi que nous avons affirmé cette ambition de neutralité climat à l'horizon 2050. Et nous sommes actifs sur le terrain de la diplomatie climatique. Avec les Nations Unies, naturellement, nous allons systématiquement tenter d'amener cette dimension pour faire progresser ensemble la capacité de faire reculer cette menace. Et puis, il y a un troisième point que je voudrais mentionner. Finalement, que ce soit au siècle passé, les tragédies, les guerres, que ce soit aujourd'hui encore, partout dans le monde où il y a des tensions, des conflits et donc de la douleur, je pense qu'il y a un point que l'on ne doit jamais perdre de vue, c'est finalement cette appartenance à une humanité commune. Et cette conviction, c'est ce qui est écrit avec éloquence dans la Charte des Nations Unies, que la dignité de chaque être humain, quelle que soit son origine, quel soit le lieu de sa naissance, sa condition sociale, sa dignité, sa liberté personnelle, l'enjeu aussi d'être mobilisé contre toutes les formes de discrimination, ça doit nous rassembler. Et ça, c'est le socle commun de ces valeurs universelles qui doit nous mobiliser. Et c'est en cela que cette menace qui n'est pas nouvelle, qui s'est encore déployée de manière douloureuse, brutale, ici en France, en Autriche, ailleurs dans le monde, le terrorisme, il doit tous nous mobiliser. On doit être mobilisés pour attaquer ces causes profondes, c'est-à-dire les discours de haine, l'apologie du terrorisme, la tentation de certains d'instrumentaliser pour nourrir un cercle vicieux, le cercle vicieux de la méfiance, du rejet, et puis parfois malheureusement du passage à l'acte violent. Et au contraire, on doit être effectivement dans le dialogue, dans la compréhension mutuelle, mais en étant très ferme sur ce socle commun de valeurs fondamentales, la liberté de croire ou de ne pas croire, le respect pour les croyances des uns et des autres, mais la conviction aussi que les libertés fondamentales, les libertés qui nous rassemblent, doivent être en permanence au cœur de nos objectifs, au cœur de nos priorités. Donc voilà quelques-uns des éléments que je souhaitais partager avec vous. Je pense que ce qui nous rassemble, c'est que nous voulons un monde plus juste, un monde plus équitable, un monde plus robuste, un monde mieux à même de résister aux chocs quand il y a des chocs. Il y en aura encore d'autres à l'avenir, être mieux préparé, et un monde dans le cadre duquel nous anticipons davantage en coopérant plus et mieux ensemble.
Merci beaucoup, Charles. Je vais maintenant donner la parole à Madame la Directrice Générale du Fonds monétaire international, chère Kristalina Georgieva.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank you wholeheartedly for bringing us together as we are wrapping up 2020, getting ready for the next year to come. Going back in history, the last big crisis, the global financial crisis, brought the world to a realization that the banking system ought to be resilient. And we have done it. Today we benefit from it. We have financial stability at the midst of a severe crisis. And the question in front of us is, are we going to step up yet again and build resilience to shocks to come for the future? In other words, is 2021 going to be a year in which we write yet another tale of two cities, more inequality within countries, across countries, across generations, or 2021 would be the year in which we come together to build more prosperous, more equitable, more sustainable world. And I so strongly believe that what we do today is to mobilize for that collective action that would determine where we would land. And in that regard, I want to make 3 points. One, to recognize that 2020, yes, the year of the worst pandemic in a century, the year of the worst depression since the worst recession since the Great Depression, but also the year in which governments and central banks have acted in a synchronized manner decisively and put a floor under the world economy. $12 trillion of fiscal action and incredible liquidity support from central banks. It is also the year in which we have seen incredible momentum in research, as Jean-Michel just said. And I would give you one small example, something that nobody probably paid attention to. That was also the year in which, at the IMF, we got a new member. Andorra, a small country, became the 190th member of the IMF. A small symbol of the big message that we are in this together. So what does that being in this together mean for the next year? First, it means we do need to put a strong public investment push to lift up growth at a time when we have ample idle capacity and interest rates are very low. And we ought to do that in a coordinated manner. Deployed with an objective to address the other crisis, the climate crisis, with the objective to promote digitalization so we can have a more equitable world. If we act together, if the G20 countries move together, invest together at the same time, rather than in this synchronized manner, they would spend a third less to achieve the same output goal than if they acted alone. So we can build an impetus for growth and jobs and do it more effectively together. Second, as we do so, we must not forget the developing world. We must make sure that we invest liquidity and we boost investment there as well. Because if we don't, the risk of deepening inequality is high. The loss of what we have achieved in the fight against poverty can be very real. And I want to vouch for the IMF commitment to be part of this boost of investment capacity. And I would like to make sure that we make best use of the SDRs in that regard, so we can help the developing world go up. And last but not least, in this collective action, we ought to think of what we leave to the future generations. It cannot be that we load them with unsustainable debt. It cannot be that we miss on greening their future. I am very keen to see action on three fronts: on high-quality public investment to help us with fiscal sustainability, generate income and growth; on dealing with debt early, not wait. If debt has to be restructured, do it early; and on improving the tax system so we can have a tax for the 21st century. I mean, how can it be that we have the digital economy benefiting greatly from this crisis? It is accelerating its income growth, and yet we cannot agree on a digital tax that is applied globally for fairness of how we share the benefits and the burden of development. Magnitude of challenges, great. But what I felt here is that our cooperative spirit is even greater. And when we come here for the next year, Paris Peace Forum, we will celebrate acting together. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Directrice Générale. Merci à vous, chers amis, pour ces propos introductifs. Je vais maintenant vous laisser poursuivre et il y a le secrétaire général des Nations Unies puis le président Xi Jinping qui vont s'exprimer avant d'autres dirigeants et vous retrouver. Merci beaucoup. Et comme l'a dit Madame la Directrice Générale, nous continuons le travail. Donc je compte sur les contributions de toutes et tous en espérant que le rendez-vous de l'année prochaine sera un point d'étape important pour ces travaux. Merci de votre présence et bon courage à tous.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel.
Merci, mes amis.
There, that was the live session from the Élysée Palace for this official ceremony of the Paris Peace Forum. I'd love to know, Justin, what you take away from what we just listened to, from what we just witnessed happening live.
So a few things that I've heard was, obviously around the overall idea. Let's take a step back. The overall idea, I think, was to try to think about which principles should guide us in the post-COVID world. And what I have heard was about health and making health, and in particular vaccines, a global public good, which implies, I think, a certain number of, let's say, adjustments on how we go about doing business on vaccines. So global public good. I heard President Macky Sall talk about values and the dialogue of culture. I think there was a strong Europe-Africa axis in this overall discussion, and I think that was important. And I say Europe because Charles Michel. I heard Charles Michel suggest a change in the way we deal with. This is a bit technical, but the special drawing rights, les droits de tirage spéciaux, and that rich countries should just abandon them in favor of the low and medium income countries. If I heard him correctly, I think that would be an interesting evolution. And more generally, what I heard was a call from President Macron to sort of elaborate with a number of leaders who were gathered here. So we had the four who were present physically at the Élysée, but Angela Merkel, Ursula von der Leyen, and Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, were also present before that public part. And what I understand is that they tried to start reaching a consensus on these principles, on climate, on global public good for vaccines, etc., that they would have in a sort of consensus, a sort of post-COVID consensus or Paris consensus that they would be able to elaborate on during the year that is coming now.
So the birth then of the idea of a Paris consensus on these matters. We're going to take you now to the next part of the planned events of the day, which is Finance in Common, an opportunity for development banks to get together and see how they can cooperate and what they can do to help in finding solutions to this.